Welcome to the final episode of our Americans at the Nurburgring series, where I finally managed to get a car around the Nurburgring in under 8 minutes. With the Firebird on a boat headed back to the States and one last weekend in Germany, there was only one thing I wanted to do. The only question was what car to rent for my final attack on the Nurburgring. I could have whipped out our credit card and rented a Track Prep GTR. That felt just a little too much like cheating though, and I wanted something more closely matched to the Firebird and the Boss 302. Which brings us to the M3 RS, a heavily modified version of Germany's answer to the front-engine V8 track day crowd. With a 4-liter V8 producing 450 horsepower at nearly 9,000 RPM, backed by a close ratio 7-speed double clutch, the RS was more than a match for our two muscle cars in a straight line. And with racing brakes and fully adjustable suspension, it looked on paper like it would crush our two muscle cars around a circuit. Except for the two things they didn't advertise on their website. First, and most important when you're talking about lap times, is tires. On tourist days, the car had to be road legal. This meant that the nose-heavy sedan had to go out on its original 245 front tire and 265 rear tire. Which brings us to today's life lesson. Sometimes it's just better to admit that you have a problem, so you can deal with it honestly and effectively, as American manufacturers have with their nose-heavy track cars, the GT350R and Z28, both of which wear massive 305 section front tires. I think the German engineers were suffering just a bit of denial about how heavy the E92 M3 had become. To their defense though, I'm sure they would argue the little tires were there for better steering feel. And the E92 M3 was undoubtedly the benchmark sedan of its generation for handling balance and composure. But that brings us to the second problem. If you're not going to put a much wider, stickier tire on the car, what are you hoping to achieve with an adjustable suspension? The answer seems obvious in hindsight. If you're going to hand over the keys to a $100,000 race car to anybody who can come up with $700, and then let them lap it around the most dangerous racetrack in the world, the last thing you want is balanced handling. You want that gentleman racer, idiot-proof handling. The front suspension was set so stiff that every time you tossed the car into a corner, it felt like all 3,700 pounds of mass rolled over onto the outside front tire, and then it would just plow into understeer. As frustrating as that was, the real lap time killer was that my brain would just not accept how little front end grip there was on the way out of a corner. So I'd start to feed in the power too early, the car would push wide, then I'd have to lift to scrub speed and get the car back online. And that was disastrous for corner exit speed, the most important part of the corner. All this understeer was very safe, but if you're not careful, and the previous renter had not been, it results in a vicious cycle, where the front tires would overheat, inducing more understeer, inducing more heat, and eventually obliterating the front tires. Which explained the first thing I noticed when I walked up to the car. The front tires were nearly bald and had that bluish-gray hue of baked rubber, yet the rears had full tread and were shoe-polish black. The mechanic apologized for the condition of the front tires and he offered the next fastest car they had available, a Track Prep hatchback, ironically in white, an obvious metaphor for its chance of going under 8 minutes. The first lap was a soul-crushing 8:39, 1 full second slower than my first ever flying lap in Chris's stock 6-speed M3, and that had been with a pair of passengers in it. I pulled into the car park after that first lap to appreciate the enormity of the task ahead. I had 4 laps to go and 40 seconds to shave from my lap time. To make things worse, everything I'd learned up to that point about track driving was utterly useless in the M3. In the Firebird, the front end would always get you pointed at the apex. The trick was to be smooth enough releasing the brakes and picking up the throttle to not lose the rear end in the process. The M3 handled more like the old snowplow I drove back in high school. Actually, that's unfair to Big Red. Big Red had a significantly more delicate handling balance than this pig. Now, before I get too down on the M3, there were 3 big advantages. This was my first experience, though far from last, with a genuine racing brake pad. Noisy and frighteningly ineffectual when cold, but ferocious and fade-free once they get up to temperature. with peak speeds matching and sometimes exceeding the two muscle cars, but minimum corner speeds 10 to 15 miles an hour lower. Not to mention more mass, the M3 desperately needed those ferocious brakes. Second was the transmission. Now, people too often think the main advantage of a double clutch is the speed of the shift. They forget that gearing often plays just as big a role in those headline acceleration or lap times that manufacturers love to quote. Personally, I will own a 3-pedal track car until I die. I love that they offer that perfect blend of challenge and reward that the human brain craves. But I don't care who you are, on a track you're faster in a 2-pedal car, and it's not the gearing or the speed of the shift. It's the processing limit of the human brain. Now, each person is of course different, and the vastness of the gap we get between students here in flight school has fascinated me for years now. But there's one thing that holds true for all of them. From the bottom of the spectrum to the very top, any attention you can free up from one task can be applied to another. In this case, the mental effort you're using for heel and toe downshifts can be applied to trail braking and turn in, not to mention leaving both hands on the wheel and allowing you to left foot brake. The last advantage of the M3 actually inspired the Firebird aerodynamic project we'll be featuring next, and it's something that was embarrassingly eye-opening for someone who teaches rotary wing aerodynamics for a living. In my defense, though, the theory of lift I'd been taught in flight school was disproved some years ago. I distinctly remember walking out to the helicopter to pull pitch the next day with a little bit of apprehension, but I'll be damned if it didn't just take off the same as it had before. I guess no one told the helicopters. I'd run in 4 cars that could hit over 150 miles an hour on the ring, and they all had noticeably less front-end grip once you get above 100 miles an hour. Having no experience outside those 4, it never occurred to me that that wasn't just the way cars handled. The Firebird was the most dramatic. Pointed at the front, curved over the top, and flat on the bottom, you have to admit it bears more than a striking resemblance to an airfoil. GM's solution to this was simple. If you've got a wing and you don't want to make lift with it, give it a negative angle of attack. I thought that the car's stock rake looked stupid, so I adjusted the rear spring purchase to give the car a static, level attitude. And, thanks to the soft springs, the car would take on a positive angle of attack and severe push under throttle. But when you went to the brakes and the nose tucked down, the car would go back to its normal oversteer handling balance, making the car more pitch sensitive at speed than anything I have driven before or since. Interestingly, Adam had made the same mistake with the Boss 302. Not only did he lower the rear of the car more than the front, but he then put a taller tire on the front of the car, giving it a slight nose-up attitude, which looked cool, but it made it impossible for that sweet-looking front splitter to do its job of maintaining a low-pressure area under the nose. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the M3 RS was making drive it upside down in a tunnel levels of downforce with that go-kart rear wing and rake stance. I'm just saying it was a revelation to not have the front-end lift I'd gotten so used to. And it's hard to overstate what a big difference that can make when you're flying through the air, bouncing off the limiter in 5th gear at an indicated 161 miles an hour, as you do in the M3. The second lap was wasted due to a big accident, but with the front tires and brakes warmed up, the car cut an 8:14 on the 3rd lap. Another wreck foiled the 4th lap, leaving me with about 15 minutes till the ring closed for the day. And with that once more for the rest of your life time attack mentality, I managed the only oversteer of the entire day. But even with only light traffic, the lap was a disappointing 8:08. I couldn't believe I had just spent almost $1,000 to go 5 seconds slower than my Firebird. As I rolled down from gantry, I noticed that no one was going out and that the car park was completely empty. At first I thought they had closed the track early, so I rolled up and asked the lady at the gate what was going on. She said, "No, the track's open." And the last car to go out was one of the safety cars a few minutes ago. And suddenly there was a little sparkle of hope. With no traffic, I thought this might just be possible. I pulled up to the gate and I waited to build up as much clear track in front of me as I could. After a couple of minutes, a trio of cars pulled up behind me and I quickly swiped the ring card. And at a snail's pace, I crept out through the cones for the last time. I glanced anxiously at the quarter tank of fuel left, and I said a quick prayer to the car gods that I wasn't about to have a repeat of the Firebird's last fuel-starved lap. In my distraction, I forgot to turn off the electronic nannies. which, as it turned out, was how I should have been running the car the entire time. Set to high alert, they kicked in sooner, and they were more effective at fighting the understeer by dragging the brake on the inside rear wheel. Just watch the traction while flashing desperately through corners. It was especially effective on the way out of corners because it let me stay flat to the floor while dragging that brake, which is a great way to improve your lap times and destroy differential. I was watching this lap earlier today in preparation for recording this, and I noticed the date stamp and realized it was 3 years ago to the day that I drove the lap. I remember seeing a prototype 918 that day, running in regular tourist traffic, which seemed very odd at the time. But 3 days later, the 918 set the 6:57 production car lap record with Mark Lieb at the controls. Watching his hands on that lap is like watching the eye of a hurricane. They're remarkably slow and calm amidst the violence going on around him. Truly one of the marks of a great driver. You'll see none of that here, though. It still makes the hair on my arm stand up a bit to watch the desperation and disregard for my own safety that I think is specially reserved for young men, perhaps particularly those freshly back from combat. By the fan corner, I had yet to see any traffic, and I knew it was going to be close. As I rolled into the mini carousel, I noticed the fuel light glowing at me from the dash. As I wondered how long it had been on, I caught sight of the safety car head, and I realized either could be my undoing. Luckily, BMWs are sumped, so they run hard to that last drop of fuel, and the safety car spotted us and moved over. We crossed the line with the range to empty indicating 0, and the engine never so much as hiccuped. The time on my watch was so close, I had to check both cameras to be sure, but all three agreed. I'd made it across the line by just a little more than 2 seconds. You couldn't ask for a better last lap of the Nurburgring. Sunny skies and no traffic on a Sunday are as rare as the steaks they serve at the Piston Club. But it did leave me wondering, if this understeering pig of a car with ruined front tires could manage a 757, just how far under 8 could the Firebird have gone? Or, better yet, the even faster Boss 302. And that is what makes track days so addictive. There is always that promise of a little bit more.